In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. We apologize for our delayed start today. We had a few tech issues with our system, and actually there's good news because this next week we'll be getting a new unit, a new mixing and video switching board, which will allow us to mix everything all into one central hub instead of the sort of jimmy rig system that we've got right here. So again, I apologize for those of you who may have been waiting for us to begin the program today. We've got a very wonderful and intelligent guest on our program today, and so we'll just jump right into it. Her name is Jenna Ellis, and she is a constitutional law attorney, a contributor to the Washington Examiner, and radio host, and she's the author of The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's constitutional crisis. Jenna, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Jenna, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Sorry, yes, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks. And on today's program, you know, I invited you on because you've written this great book where you argue that the true roots of America's founding, the founding documents, is an objective morality, and that our system of government is founded upon a Judeo-Christian worldview. Some might call that sort of divine natural law. And that a secular humanist worldview really does not and cannot make sense of human rights. And so on today's program, I want to unpack this for our audience because thinking well about ethics and political philosophy is a part of what Christians should do. I know a lot of apologetic ministries sort of shy away from the political stuff, but here on the program from time to time we have political episodes because of how important this is for Christian worldview and for the future of the church. So you've written this great book, and so I want to just ask you a few questions about it. And so first I want to ask you this. So what seems to be the biggest problem that you understand for a so-called progressive government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really appreciated your introduction because it's very true that a lot of churches do shy away from entry into politics, and that's exactly not what we should be doing. Because if we look at the Christian worldview as a whole, we have to have a foundation of truth, and then every other perspective in any other subject matter, whether it's economics, whether it's law, whether it's policy, whether it's government, has to be premised and outflow from truth. And so often, and this gets into your second question, what's the biggest problem today? Well, especially for Christians, and I'm a millennial, and the students that I teach and others that are among our age group, really the main problem is this disconnection between the Christian worldview of truth and understanding an objective truth and applying that to all other areas. So rather than thinking of this comprehensively and the foundation being truth and then building up from there, often what Christians will do, especially younger Christians today, will kind of have a smorgasbord and say, okay, well, I have my Christian worldview on Sundays. That's what I believe about the truth of God. But that doesn't permeate into what I do in other aspects of my life that has no bearing on my political perspective, who I vote for in office, that has nothing to do with my career path. It has nothing to do with my sex life. It has nothing to do with anything else. And we can't approach it that way. We have to understand it comprehensively. Yeah, and
interesting that you say that, how many people will say, you know, they keep it separate. But then they want to take Jesus, some people, they want to take Jesus as their own. And they might, you know, say, well, Jesus was a socialist. He told people to share things. It's really not...
it's not a very deep thought there, and it's not really comprehensive, and it's not taking either the entirety of the truth of Scripture and looking at what has been revealed to us in both general revelation in the reality of the world to which we're presented, and also the specific revelation of the truth of the Word of God.
Yeah, amen to that. That's great. All right, so it seems that for a progressive government and one that really is taken the mantle of secularism. It strikes me, and this I think gets into a discussion of your third chapter about understanding where does morality come from. If secularism is true, well, then we should keep God and any ethical ideas that come from our belief in God out of politics, out of the halls of power. And some people posit that, well, the government should just do whatever we say it should do,
Right, the more strict democratic perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dive into that, if you will, for us.
Yeah, and so how I kind of laid out this book was talking about what does the Constitution mean in context, because often for those of us who are patriots who love to live in America, understand these ideas of liberty and freedom, want to get more invested, we don't really understand the Constitution often in context, and so we have to go back, and if we're looking at the top level issues like pro-life, for example, like same-sex marriage, like all of these things that touch and concern on our everyday lives, we have to go back to the root worldview of where does law come from. And so that's really getting into your question, Kurt, because the morality can only come from, and our system of ethics, right? The measurable difference between right and wrong, that can only come from one of two places, either man himself, whether that's one supreme sovereign man, the king, or whether it's a collective democratic mob, whether it's anarchy, whatever it is, that's still man, right? So it either can come from man or from something outside of man. And the something outside of man has to be an intelligent being, and we would understand that to be God. And we can have the conversation of who is God and all of those things as well in terms of apologetics. But coming from the perspective, C.S. Lewis wrote so brilliantly about this, in Mere Christianity, Abolition of Man, and others. But really, the root worldview is to say, where does morality come from? We all know there is a measurable difference between right and wrong, but who is the arbiter of that distinction? How do we understand that to operate in the reality to which we are presented? And so looking from a constitutional framework and looking at just law as a general philosophy, first we have to say, okay, is morality objective? Does it come from something outside of man? Does it come from God? We can look at the relationship in law between the physical universe as well as the moral universe. And we see that morality doesn't change any more than physics change, any more than the scientific world changes. There are always the same consequences to moral decisions, and we all have an understanding as a human race of the difference between right and wrong and that those exist. So this has to come from something outside of man. And if we base our law only on man's arbitrary whim, then we get to the place that law itself becomes arbitrary, and then it doesn't reflect the moral objective truth of God. And one of the great things, Kurt, about the American Constitution is that this was such a novel idea that we would root our system of law not in what a collective sovereign will or a direct democracy would do, not what just a king or a conquestor by virtue of their harsh enforcement power would decide, but rather would say our system of government is predicated on recognizing that there are unalienable rights that are given to us pre-politically by God himself, and that the only proper role of government is to preserve and protect those rights. So our Constitution doesn't give us our rights. It gives the government specific limited powers just to preserve and protect those rights.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
So definitely get the book as well. And I know Kurt's read that, but I try to unpack it very well in 13 chapters. But there is a lot.
Yes, I like what you said there about how our rights are pre-political. That for secularists, rights are given, they are conferred by the government. And so, our right to freedom of speech, our right to bear arms, our right to, not to have an unreasonable search or seizure, these according to secularism, can change. We can modify them. We could call a convention of the states, which, by the way, I want to talk to you about towards the end of our interview. But the idea here that these rights can be changed and modified, I think should be indicative for Christians that we have to stay on top of these political battles. And it maybe is how we present ourselves in these political battles that we could work on, trying to be more winsome, for example, to appeal to, say, natural law instead of only the Bible. I think Christians need to be on top of this, because next thing you know, some of these very rights which we adore and we simply take for granted in this country could be gone. They could be gone, and they might not be gone tomorrow, but they might be gone in 10, 20, 40 years. They might be gone for our grandkids. And so we have to preserve the checks and balances between the relationship between the government and the people. And for me, it's really heartbreaking when, as we've mentioned, there are Christians that just don't care. They want nothing to do with politics. I think that's a bad recipe. That's a recipe for disaster.
It is, and it's also the flip side as well, is that I often interact with people who have either read the book, listened to my radio show, will hear Veracity Hill today, for example. Hopefully people will contact me if they have any questions. And there are a lot of Christians who are very interested as well. But the problem then becomes sometimes is that we approach it just from an extreme passionate perspective without that foundation of understanding all of the nuances and understanding how law actually interacts in society and what it is that we're asserting, what our best argument is. Because, for example, as an attorney, if I go into court, I may be the most passionate person there, and I may say, Judge, you absolutely should hold this way for my client. But if I don't give him a legal reason to do that, he might say, well, Miss Ellis, great job on all your passion, but that doesn't fall in line with what I actually have the authority to do. So as Christians, we can't just be passionate. We have to also be educated and understand how our system of government works, where our rights come from, and why they can't, as you said earlier, be arbitrary. Why it's not just up to the legislature to determine, okay, you know what, today we're totally against same-sex marriage. It's been that way throughout American history, and then suddenly in 2015 with Obergefell v. Hodges, guess what? It's totally different. That then is the whim of man's authority. And I always give the example, what if Congress, tomorrow in session, were to say, what would be a really good idea for America? Let's repeal the law of gravity. We just don't want that to exist anymore. You'd laugh. Yeah, and you're laughing because we recognize Congress, as much as they might think they have the authority to do that, they just don't. They know that there is an inherent limitation because they live in reality as well. So why do they think that they can just dictate the bounds of moral truth as well? They can't. And the Constitution, in fact, says that they can't. And that's the brilliant, wonderful thing about living in an American society, is that we're not even combating against a system of government that doesn't recognize moral truth. We are premised as America on a society that recognizes that our rights come from God. The Declaration's worldview statement, we hold these truths. Truth is self-evident. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator, not their government, with certain unalienable rights. And so then the Constitution is built upon that.
Yeah. You mentioned the, I think it's, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Obergefell?
Obergefell. Yeah.
Obergefell, sorry, yeah. I'm not sure I'd ever heard someone say it that way. At any rate, and I hadn't heard anyone say the name. But so I think with that Supreme Court case, what I've told people isn't that gay marriage became the law of the land. My issue with it was that the Supreme Court overruled the will of the people in multiple states who had voted as to how they wanted their society to be run. And that, for me, was concerning because it takes away the right of people to govern themselves.
Right, and that's where we have to understand our constitutional framework and what specific limited powers are granted to the federal government to operate in very specific areas, and what is reserved through the 9th and 10th Amendment to either the states or to the people, respectively. And or to the people is very important, and that's something that both the state and federal government really doesn't talk about and doesn't recognize, that our Constitution actually grants some powers to the people to self-determine as well and to self-govern. So there are very, very very few things, even granted to the states, but especially to the federal government. Article 1, Section 8 gives very specific subject matters in the law that Congress, as a national legislature, can determine in terms of how they create the law. And then the Supreme Court can only review congressional action within the Federalist structure. So the Supreme Court can't just pick and choose and hear every case that it wants to. It's limited in terms of its own subject matter review as well. And so what should have happened, regardless of which the arguments are plentiful from a Christian worldview perspective of why Obergefell was an incorrect decision. But just strictly from a procedural standpoint, before we even get to the merits of the case, from a procedural standpoint, the Supreme Court should have said, you know what's not in Article 1, Section 8? Domestic relations as an entire subject matter. You're right, Kurt, it's reserved to the states. And they should have said, sorry, we can't declare the law of the land because, one, we're not the legislature, and two, that's not something that is a federal question.
And this is over the last, 60 or 80 years, there's a philosophy, and I've actually, I wrote a blog series on it once on the incorporation doctrine. And I take it that this decision stems from the incorporation philosophy, where the federal government is beginning to take on these cases that in the past they never would have taken. Because they, as you said, there's sort of a judicial restraint where they say, no, this is not our jurisdiction. Is that the case with that case and with other cases where the Supreme Court is now interested in whether a high school coach prays, on the football field?
Right. And, and you're talking about the incorporation doctrine that stems from the 14th Amendment, which, was one of the Reconstruction amendments after the Civil War. And in my view, is one of the most problematic amendments in terms of its language, because it just kind of opened that Pandora's box in order for the Supreme Court to look at their concept of judicial review and say, okay, we're going to just use the language of the 14th Amendment to claim more power than is actually granted by either that amendment or the Constitution as a whole. And I want to highlight, and some people have talked about this, I mean, the amendments to the Constitution, because of Article 5, do become part of the supreme law of the land. So it's no different, the language in the 14th Amendment versus, Article, 1 through 7, as far as the legitimacy of it being the supreme law of the land. But the problem is that the Supreme Court is going to, and what they've done for the past 50 or 60 years as an activist court, they have looked at the Constitution and they have twisted a lot of those terms just to fit in to what they already want to do. So putting this into maybe a church context, for example, we've all heard pastors, whether intentionally or not, want to say something, and so then they'll do their Google search or however they find it, and they find a verse totally out of context that seems to support their point, right? And if you look at the context around it, it really doesn't, but they're using it in order to get to the point that they wanted to reach anyway. That's not really good expository preaching. It's not really good originalist view of the text. It's what's called proof texting. And that's exactly what our Supreme Court is doing. And so they've done that not only from the 14th Amendment and other places in the Constitution, but then their own judicial precedent has been so far off. So one of the cases that I highlight in the book is Griswold versus Connecticut. In 1965, this was the rise of the sexual revolution. This was one of the first cases of contraceptives, and then Planned Parenthood versus Casey would come later. Of course, we ended up with Roe versus Wade. All of these sexually driven cases to say we as the government aren't going to put any kind of restraint on sexual freedoms because that's what the people are wanting to assert. And so Griswold versus Connecticut, the court in that instance looked at the Constitution, understood we actually can't determine this case. It's not a federal question. But what they did is created what's called the penumbra doctrine, which basically said that they were literally reading between the lines of the Constitution. They would find what they called rights that emanate from the vast penumbra. And then they said because those rights emanate in the space between the lines, we now have jurisdiction to determine how those rights interact in society. Rights don't even come from the Constitution, much less text that's in between the lines. It's absolutely ridiculous.
AKA text that doesn't even exist as text.
But it sounds like such a fancy doctrine, doesn't it? And you have to be one of those magical, 9 people in robes on the Supreme Court to possibly understand it. And it's purely a legal fiction.
Yeah. So, and for me, one of the most important distinctions to be made here isn't that the Supreme Court, as 9 individuals, detected that there was a certain right, but rather that they thought that there was a right and that the federal government had the obligation to protect that right, not, say, a state government, or to leave it to the states to decide. It's that overreach of power and authority, which, in my understanding, has really restricted people's ability to create societies. Sort of, a Supreme Court case once called it the laboratories of democracy, and that's, I think,
and that was the whole idea between the states, was that they would have some measure of sovereignty. And we see that they still do. And it's interesting that how the Supreme Court is even arbitrary in terms of what it picks and chooses to weigh in on. Because, for example, here in Colorado, we still have the death penalty. Texas still does. A variety of other states do. Some states in the criminal law context don't. But we don't see the Supreme Court calling that a conflict of law. And we're going to have to create the law of the land on, death penalty questions. They allow the states to have a variety of opinions and laws that are specific to the individuals that live in those states.
That's right. Yep. All right. Well, we're going to take our short break here, Jenna. But when we come back, I want to pick your brain more about the founders and their relationship to the law and different documents that they had written to help us understand a bit better about the structure, the philosophy of federalism that they put into place, and so that we can understand how best to go forward to perhaps bringing back a little bit of the vision that they had for this nation. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google Grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. Today we are talking about the need for a moral constitution, and we're not just talking about why it would be nice in society if people had moral lives. We're talking about the intellectual grounding for a moral constitution. That on secularism, you really can't have a moral constitution. Where do morals even come from? And that comes from ultimately from the Creator. And joining me on today's program is Jenna Ellis. She is a constitutional law attorney, contributor to the Washington Examiner, and a radio host. Jenna, now before we get into the second half of today's program, where I'm going to ask you more about the founders and what they believed, we do a short segment on the program here called Rapid Questions, where we ask kind of goofy, unrelated questions to our guests, and we intentionally try to catch you off guard here. And so there's a minute clock that you won't be able to hear, but the guests, our audience, can. And so I'll start that clock and ask you the first question. So are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
All right, here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Oh, Ann Taylor and White House Black Market.
And what school did you go to?
I was homeschooled K through 12, loved it, and then have a bachelor's degree in journalism from Colorado State University, and then I'm a proud graduate with my Juris Doctor degree of law from the University of Richmond.
Nice. What's your favorite sport?
Baseball.
Ooh, have you ever had a Dr. Pepper?
I have.
And if you were given a Dr. Pepper right now, would you drink it?
I would.
Excellent. If you were stranded on an island, what's one thing you'd be sure to keep with you?
A book.
And what fruit would you say your head is shaped like?
Oh gosh, probably a pineapple because I have like crazy hair.
What is your inner milkshake flavor?
Chocolate.
And what's your favorite movie?
Beauty and the Beast.
If you were a baseball pitch, which one would you be?
Curveball.
All right. Nice. Well, that's the round of rapid questions. I am so very glad to hear that you are a fan of Dr. Pepper.
Yes. Who isn't? That's
amen. Who is not a fan of Dr. Pepper? That is the best drink on planet Earth, as far as I'm concerned. So you live in Colorado. You're a baseball fan. So does that mean you are a Rockies fan?
Absolutely. And there are several good friends of mine. We've had this conversation over the last couple of days who are Angels fans, but go Rockies. So Mike Segovia, if you're listening, shout out to the Rockies.
Well, I'm a diehard Cubs fan, and I know that the Rockies and Cubs have had a couple interesting series recently. So I'm not sure how they all ended, though. I'd have to look that up. But I do have Nolan Arenado on my fantasy team, and actually Trevor Story. So I'll take the Rockies where I can get them.
Good. Then we can still be friends.
All right. So back to today's topic. We're talking about the need for a moral constitution. And in the first half of the program, we talked about the importance of having that intellectual basis for where morals even come from, and how secularism really doesn't work on that, and how over time the federal government has sort of overreached their initial boundaries. And so to help folks understand, well, why it is that, since you and I think, see eye to eye on this for the most part, why that's the case, tell me about the founders and their relationship to law.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And part of what we have to understand about the Constitution and even the Constitutional Convention and the Founding Fathers themselves is that often we'll look at them as, great historical figures and who they were as family men, which is all very accurate and true. But one of the most kind of overlooked aspect is that the majority of the Founding Fathers, in fact, it was, I think, about 35 of the 55 signers, or 32, were actually lawyers. And so they understood law and policy. They understood what it means to have legitimate law in society. And they weren't just this, great rabble of patriots that came together and threw together this brilliant document. So in fact, the 5 founders that were on the Declaration Committee, we know Thomas Jefferson primarily because he was the primary drafter, but all 5 of the founders that were on the Declaration Committee were lawyers. So they understood the philosophy of law. They understood also the history of it. They understood what bills of rights were in Old England. They understood that typically those would be rights that the people would reserve to themselves, to say, we can't give up everything to the king. We can't just allow this arbitrary man dictator. And so when the founders and Madison and Hamilton had this great debate about whether or not we should even have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and I actually agree with Hamilton in the sense that he argued in Federalist 84 that said, bills of rights in the sense for which they're contended don't actually make sense in the context of our Constitution, because our Constitution doesn't give us our rights. It gives the government specific limited powers. So why should we create a Bill of Rights that would look like to future generations, say our current Supreme Court, for example, that just because we have the text of freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, now the government thinks that they can over-regulate it simply because we have those amendments. And I think from, 2018 vantage point, it's probably a good idea that we have those specifically as fundamental rights. But the point here is that the founders understood, regardless of whether the First Amendment, Second Amendment, all of those even exist, even if tomorrow we were to repeal the First Amendment, you and I would still have the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, all of those freedoms and rights that are endowed by God that the government still couldn't do anything differently about.
Yeah. So when we're talking about these rights here, the Bill of Rights, what you're saying here is that the first 10 amendments weren't necessarily saying, person A over there, you have this thing, this value to you. Really, what it's saying is person A has that value, and therefore the government won't stop them from doing that. So really the Bill of Rights is sort of just like a restriction upon what the government would do, more so than saying that the government's going to give someone to something. Is that right?
So the Bill of Rights acts basically as a redundancy safeguard, because the Article 1, Section 8, as we talked about on the first part of this program, is that those are the specific subject matters that Congress can legislate on. So, for example, immigration is a federal question. It is something that Congress can look at and say what makes sense for our entire country, for the Union. And so what's not in there are any of the particular rights that are given by God, our Creator. And so the Bill of Rights basically says, Congress, if you didn't understand what you're limited to in Article 1, Section 8, we're going to tell you specifically certain things that are so incredibly important that the founders knew are most often over-infringed by the government. We are going to specifically say, Congress shall make no law. That is the very first phrase in the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law. And so often we have a completely inverted perspective, and we'll term it as my First Amendment right. That's not precisely accurate. It's my unalienable God-given right that the First Amendment is designed to preserve and protect. And that is an incredibly important distinction. It's not just semantics, because if we look at it as a First Amendment right, then what happens tomorrow if the government interprets it differently, or if the First Amendment would suddenly not exist? Then if my right is only my right because it's in the First Amendment, it becomes a privilege that the government is granting to me, not an unalienable right.
Right. So let's talk there. You mentioned if the Constitution were interpreted differently. So tell me about the philosophy of originalism.
Yeah, and this is we could unpack this for an entire program, and maybe we can do that at some point. But the basic philosophy is that we interpret the document understanding what it means in context. And so, for example, again, if I went into court and I had a legal contract between two parties that said, Kurt owes me $500, right? And suddenly I would say to the court, well, $500, back in that day, XYZ, this really you should interpret it to mean $5 million, right? And the judge would laugh and be like, that's not a fluid document. It says what it says. You're limited to the scope of the words. Well, why is it that the Constitution is the only document in the world that is so magical that we can't precisely ascertain its meaning, and we have to try to divine what George Washington would have thought about iPhones? That's not what this is about. It's about saying, what are the powers that are given to the government to operate on today's issues? So it doesn't matter what George Washington would have thought about an iPhone. What matters is what powers did they specifically intend to give to government to operate. And so then we can start addressing the political questions based on what the government can and can't do. So the originalist philosophy is that we have a document that says what it says, it means what it means, and that we can know that 240 years later, just like any other document. We look at the Magna Carta. We look at, even going back to the apologetics view. I mean, we look at scriptural documents that are way more than 240 years old, and we know exactly what they mean. This isn't some magical concept of originalism. It's just the way to interpret the Constitution that doesn't mean that people can just make it out to be whatever they want it to mean.
But that's because it's not hip and cool, Jenna. It's not hip to think that people can say what they want.
Right,
because you might hurt my feelings.
Well, too bad. But I don't intend ever to. But that's part of speaking truth. Is sometimes the truth hurts, and sometimes we have to. I mean, just like if I were to go to the second story of my apartment building and fall and jump off of it, gravity would kick in. It would hurt. But that doesn't mean that I can say, well, just because gravity is offending me, then suddenly it doesn't exist in reality. And so we have to make sure that we understand the difference between reality and these false constructs of this, sort of hyper oversensitive world that doesn't want to live in reality. It just doesn't that way in terms of our biological reality, and it doesn't work that way in our legal reality either. I mean, imagine, Kurt, for example, if we went into court and someone was charged with a DUI, driving under the influence, and their defense was, well, I didn't feel like I was drunk, so you can't say that I was. How would our law ever say, have any enforcement power, have any legitimacy, or be able to be predictable? Wouldn't.
Yep. And it seems like for people that want the law to change, well, there's a way to make that happen. First, I would say let the states make it happen. So it's amazing that people want Washington, D.C. to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, why don't you have your state capital do X, Y, and Z first? And we'll see how that plays out before we demand other states to do, X, Y, and Z. But that's not the route people want to take.
Right. Well, because often, when we see on mainstream media and the news, there's such an emphasis on the federal Congress, and we see almost these, political celebrities where everybody knows, different senators and representatives on a national level, but hardly anyone would know the state representative. I mean, some people even in their own state don't even know. Right. And so we tend to go and think that, we have to make the biggest impact by going to the highest office. But that's not always the case, because Congress actually doesn't have the same authority that my Colorado state legislature does. My Colorado state legislature doesn't have unbridled authority either, because remember what we talked about. Some of those powers are actually reserved to the state, to the people, not just the state. So, for example, parental rights and church government systems. I mean, God established the civil government authority, but also the family government and the church government.
That's right.
Those are also self-regulating. And those are not touch points. They do interact all together, but they have a very different sphere of authority than the civil government.
Jenna, I know you've got to leave here soon, but before we let you go, tell us about the Convention of the States.
Yes, thank you so much for that opportunity, because I am an advocate for the Convention of States, and the primary reason is because Article 5 in the U.S. Constitution allows for the Constitution to be amended in two separate ways. We currently have 27 amendments that have been duly ratified. I'm super happy about that, because as a woman, I can vote. That was an amendment, right? So, and we're also, really excited about some of the other amendments. No one ever has said that amending it the first way, which is through Congress, that somehow tomorrow when Congress is in session, oh no, they're going to rewrite the entire Constitution. No, we all understand they don't have that authority. Well, when Congress convenes, anytime they could propose a constitutional amendment. In the exact same way, if enough states get together and want to convene together like a Congress, they then have the authority under Article 5 to propose amendments. They would have to be duly ratified in the exact same way as congressional amendments versus a state constitutional amendment in a convention of states. So this term convention is what people are really hung up on, but all that means is that the states send delegates to convene. I mean, it's no different than, are we really super concerned that at the Republican National Convention or at, the convention at the downtown Hilton that suddenly the U.S. Constitution is going to be rewritten? No, the conventions happen all the time. What matters is, what are they authorized to do? What the states are authorized to do is the same thing under Article 5 as the United States Congress. And frankly, there are more conservatives and people who would actually put forward some common sense amendments in the state legislature than you will ever see through Congress in our current political climate. And that's why the Convention of States project has gotten together for three specific reasons. They want to impose term limits, balance the budget, and then also judicial reform. Judicial reform is key. We need that. The states can do it because Congress won't. And the founders unanimously added that on proposal because at the original Constitutional Convention, because they recognized that the states might step in to protect and preserve our fundamental unalienable rights when Congress wouldn't. And that's what we're seeing today.
It's a way for the states to come together and bypass the ineffective bureaucrats and some wimpy or lacking courage politicians.
Yeah,
in
and
Washington,
Article
D.C.
5 gives them that power. I mean, there are two completely different ways that we can go about doing this. And when Congress won't, the states have the specific delegated power to do that. We've just never, as states, taken advantage of that particular provision of Article 5. And we should and we need to.
Yeah, great. Well, Jenna, we're going to put a link to your Twitter and Facebook on our website along with this episode, and we'll also put a link to the Conventions of the States project so people can learn more about that. So thank you so much for joining us on today's program.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate being with you.
Of course. God bless. And we'll bring you on again to maybe just talk about originalism for the whole episode. That'd be great.
Sounds good. I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. All right, so that was Jenna Ellis. She is a constitutional law attorney, contributor to the Washington Examiner, and radio host. And we'll put up some links on our website so you can be sure to follow her. She's got some great commentary and analysis on hot topic issues that are going on in our country right now. And you might be able to hear the firefighter running, the fire truck going right on by our office. Yes, I would like to, again, apologize for the delayed start to today's program. We had some tech issues, but there's good news on the way. This past week, we ordered a very nice video switcher. It also has audio capabilities there. It's called the Roland VR50. It's a high-tech piece of equipment, so we're going to streamline our process for how we bring in the different cameras and the audio all into one hub and then send it to the computer that we use to live stream. So hopefully your viewing experience will be improved through this. And of course, we couldn't have done that without the help of our patrons, who are folks that just chip in a few bucks a month to make this program run. All right, so tomorrow is Mother's Day, and as I was thinking about what to say about Mother's Day, I'm so grateful for my wife, Michaela, the mother of 3 children now. In case you haven't heard, we are expecting number 3. We're excited about that. That human will show up into my hands some point in early November, and so we're very excited about that. And today we're talking about the role of government, ethics, and the way it plays into society. And the future of society depends upon a well-ordered relationship between the government and the people. And one of the ways that society can continue to flourish is through mothers. Because if women stopped being mothers, society would cease to exist. I know this might be a profound truth to some, but we're all here as a result of some woman that decided that they wanted to bear child. And it's really a blessing and an honor, and I want to encourage you to touch base with your mother tomorrow and to thank those that are mothers tomorrow. I know for our guest preacher tomorrow at my church, the fellow will be speaking on anger. We're going through a series on the 7 deadly sins, and so he was a bit perplexed how you do a sermon on anger on Mother's Day. So best of luck and God's providence to him on that. All right, well, we have a substitute tech producer today. Chris is out down in Florida, and Chris will be absent for a number of weeks here over the next couple months. He's getting married, so he's got a lot on his plate right now. Rob Emmett is filling in for Chris. Rob, thanks so much for coming into the studio today.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, so 2 B's, 2 E's, 2 M's, 2 T's in your name, Rob Emmett.
It's a little redundant, isn't it?
There's a lot of double letters there. Tell me the background of Rob 2 B's. Are there 2 B's in Robert?
No, I was born Robert, the normal spelling, but apparently, I don't remember, but there was another Rob in preschool, and my mom wanted to distinguish me.
So she threw on another B.
Another B, and it's been that way ever since.
Okay, nice. Well, Rob, you own your own video production company, and you are also the leader for the, I always get it wrong, leader for the Illinois Colson Fellows affiliate program or something like that.
That's right.
So tell me about that and what you do.
The Colson Fellows program used to be called the Centurions program. It was a ministry Chuck Colson started probably 15, 20 years ago now. He passed away, of course, a couple years ago, and the program continued on, and they updated the name to be the Colson Fellows program. John Stonestreet is part of the group that oversees that now. And a couple of years ago, they began to start affiliate programs across the country because instead of everybody having to go to one place a couple times a year to have their residencies, they figured it was easier and cheaper for more people to be able to access the program, to do affiliate programs. So I went through the program a couple of years ago in the Wisconsin affiliate.
Okay.
And then this past year, a group of us here in Illinois decided to start our own affiliate here in the Chicagoland area.
Nice.
So this was our first year.
Yeah, and it's so in a nutshell, it's a discipleship program that helps folks to learn more about the Christian worldview, and not just learn it, but then apply it as well.
Yeah. Besides the head knowledge and the group learning, you remember Chuck Colson was a former Marine, so he was all about doing stuff, and he did a lot of stuff. But part of the program is you come out with a 3-year plan of what you're going to do in ministry with what you learned.
Nice.
To impact your little part of the world.
Giving people goals, and sometimes people just rush into ministry without a plan. And so then things begin to fall apart because they're not organized, even mentally. So if you've got that plan in place, you've got benchmarks to meet, and you've got a goal to get to. So that's good. Nice. Well, we'll be sure to put a link up so people can learn more about that program as well. And we look forward to having you fill in for Chris over several weeks here. Hopefully today wasn't, it's a big learning curve on the first day, I take it.
When's that switcher coming?
Yeah. The switcher is actually coming this next week. So we'll have it for next week. I think Chris will be here next week, but I know we've got you coming up for a few weeks here in the next couple months. But yeah, that video switcher will be very nice. I know we had some tech issues just today here this afternoon, and a little bit of a delayed start, but hopefully it's been okay for folks. And then I'm really hoping we'll see a big improvement in what's called the latency. So sometimes folks might see that my mouth is moving either before or after the audio. That's called a latency issue. I'm learning all sorts of things here doing this program. So hopefully that unit will be able to fix each input and so it'll be a lot easier. But of course that's another thing to learn for all of us. So great to have you here, Rob, and I look forward to having you assist in the production here of the podcast. So thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that does it for today's program. I hope that this has been encouraging to you. I know that, again, for some Christians, they don't want to think deeply about how their Christian faith should apply into the realm of politics. But if you think that, say, Marxism doesn't pose a threat to the Christian church, I think you are very mistaken. The Christian church is in a war, and we are in a war not of flesh and blood, but of ideas, dark forces, and while the church will ultimately survive, that doesn't mean we should lose battles for being lazy. It's really important for Christians to think well about these topics. So if you want to hear more topics like this and you've got suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me, kurt@veracityhill.com. And I'm happy to take topic suggestions, or if you have a guest that you'd like to hear on the program and you want to ask them questions as well, we can arrange those interviews. So I hope that these types of topics are beneficial for you. And I know that we've had a string of apologetic and theological topics, so I'm glad we could get a political one, which, of course, it all falls within the realm of theology, but how we can describe them sometimes, we use different camps to describe different topics, different terms and labels. There's a taxonomy, if you will. All right, now before we go, I do want to mention this. We have a conference coming up in September 28 and 29. It's on divine genocide, genocide in Scripture. We are bringing in a host of scholars to present their unique perspectives on how to interpret the supposed genocide commands in the Old Testament. We're bringing in Dr. John Walton, Paul Copan, Clay Jones, and Kenton Sparks. It's going to be fascinating. Each of them are going to present a case for why their interpretation should be advocated for. And then at the end of the event, we're going to have a roundtable discussion where there's going to be some fist fights. No, I'm just kidding. Fireworks are going to be up in the air. Well, maybe I'm kidding about that too. You get what I'm saying. It's going to be fascinating to hear these guys come together. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any other event that has picked this topic as a theme to really kind of hammer out and present for people an array of interpretations within Christendom for how they could understand these ancient war passages. Copan thinks it's war rhetoric, for example. So I would love it if you were to join us at this event. It's the type of thing that you might consider flying in for. We're hoping for lots of people. It'll be a great time. We'll have different apologetic organizations represented at the event. So I hope that you'll consider joining us. All right, well, that does it for today's program. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. I want to thank our technical producer, Rob, and look forward to seeing him over a few weeks here throughout the next couple months. And I want to thank our guest, Jenna Ellis, for her time and enlightening us about these historical, political issues that still bear effects to this day and for which we are even responsible ourselves as voters. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.